Hi, this is Chapter 6, an overview of critical and feminist approaches to organizations or to looking at organizations. In this lecture, I will explain the basic concepts associated with critical theory. And instead of discussing and explaining how organizations function as we've done in the past chapters, we'll look at organizations through the radical frame. Or a radical frame or a critical frame as sites of domination using the ideas of Karl Marx, who I am sure you've probably heard of, but he was a German 19th century intellectual who examined the relationship between owners and workers within a capitalistic society. In his work, Marx theorized that there was an inherent balance in the owner-worker relationship, and that eventually, because workers would get tired of this type of relationship, they would revolt against the system. So we're also going to look at the ways in which Catherine Miller, our textbook author, separates feminist theory from its traditional inclusion into critical theory. So let's start with Burrell and Morgan's political of reference. They propose three different types of frames when looking at organizations: the unitary frame, the pluralist frame, and the radical frame. Now, in the theories that we've looked at so far from chapters 1 to 4 have used unitary and pluralistic frames. So with a unitary frame, there's emphasis placed on common organizational goals. Conflict is mostly suppressed due to the power of managers. And conflict is seen as rare and negative within an organization that looks at its environment in a unitary frame. With a pluralist frame, there are many small groups within the organization that have different organizational interests. Conflict is seen as a very natural part of organizing. And it's also seen as positive, just as one of those things that is part of the environment. So in this chapter, we're going to use the radical frame as we look at the ideas throughout this chapter. Going back to Marx, whose work has been applied in many different ways. So with the radical frame, theorists view the organization as a battleground in which all parties fight for resources, and conflict and power are largely seen as reflecting those of the society in which the organization resides. So there's rivalry within this, and as you can see, conflict because we're using the metaphor of the battleground. So think about the radical frame as we move through these concepts in this chapter. Keep that in mind. So foundational ideas of critical theories are: certain social structures and processes lead to imbalances of power. Imbalances of power lead to alienation and oppression for certain groups. And then the role of the critical theorist becomes one that is to explore and uncover these imbalances and bring awareness to the oppressed group, which may lead to emancipation or freedom from oppression. So this almost functions as a rhetorical syllogism. If you've studied that in any of your classes, it is a logic equation. As one thing leads to another, these ideas build on each other. If a critical theorist brings a problem or awareness to an oppressed group, then they are suddenly aware that there is an imbalance of power and that they feel alienated. And there is more development or more discussion about this in the text, but if you think about it this way, you think about factory work in this instance. And watch this 2-minute movie clip from the movie Norma Ray. I don't know if you're familiar with this movie, but Sally Fields starred in this movie. It was made in the late 70s. And she is a woman who feels very oppressed in the first place for being a Southern woman who becomes a union organizer in her small town factory. And just in this short clip, it demonstrates so many of the concepts that we're looking at in the chapter. So just take, it's like a 2 or 3 minute clip and watch it. And let's look at the components of critical theory. The first one we have is power, and there are many different types of power. But power is traditionally paired with control and domination. So there are 3 different types of power. The traditional approach to power is that power is relatively stable for those who possess it. The symbiological approach is that power is based on communicative interactions and relations, so it's very intimate. And then the radical critical approach is based, says that economic, social, and communicative relationships produce deep structures. So we're going to look a little bit closer at those deep structures. But look on page 102 at table 6.1 of for sources of power in organizations first. Miller lists several of these, or actually this is from an article by Morgan from 1986, but it says the following are among the most important sources of power in organizations. So you have formal authority, which is usually informed by hierarchy. Who's the boss? Who is in charge? Who can make decisions? There's also scarce resources. So maybe there's a little money in a budget that can go toward 1 or 2 departments. So that creates a power struggle in an organization. There's control of decisions, control of boundaries. You know, who gets the most space, who gets to expand, who doesn't in an organization. And gender is also one. So there are several. Just take the time to read over table 6.1. All right, let's look at control of modes and means of production, because it is also a source of power. So classic Marxist theory examines the way in which capitalist owners, of course, have control over workers. I've already said this, just restating. So translate this to the manager-employee relationship. Think about control. Workers on assembly lines produce products but are separate from what they produce. Critical theorists argue that this leaves the workers alienated from their work and it dehumanizes them. Work is a commodity. So think about the first case study we had in the chicken processing plant, and how many of you mentioned that the process, the assembly line process, was very dehumanizing. Workers weren't even allowed to go to the bathroom most of the time. They just had to stand there and work. So this is definitely a component of critical theory when you look at the control and the modes and the means of production and how work can dehumanize people. Then think about maybe a monotonous job that you've had. Many of us have worked in retail or in an office where we have repetitive tasks. We repeat the same tasks over and over. Someone can easily be trained to take our job because we are replaceable. This leads critical theorists to see these type of workers as oppressed and alienated, just like factory workers, and just like in the Norma Ray clip, if you've taken the time to watch that. There's also surveillance. We've talked about this, about how we're monitored at work, how our keystrokes are monitored, how our internet usage is monitored and controlled. Maybe your phone calls with clients or customers are recorded. It's very common to call into some place and say, hear the recording, this call is being monitored for, customer service purposes or whatever, training purposes. So we're also controlled by the monotony of a job, repetitive tasks, and means of surveillance. So think about that as we look through the radical lens. The other aspect of power is control of organizational discourse. And these are the stories that employees tell to make sense of organizational life. Mundy and Dietz are mostly the theorists that I'm referring to when I'm going over these concepts, by the way. So the stories that employees tell to make sense of organizational life are often the dominant or common story that's been told over and over in an organization. Who is in charge of the discourse in an organization? A manager? A department? A CEO? What about the way you talk within your smaller organizational groups? Is it recognized as the dominant discourse or a sub-discourse? Power controls the way that discourse is used in an organization. It also defines control by establishing the jargon we use in our organizations, or how we define the ways that events happen in our organizations. So that was a quick review of power. Let's look at and hegemony, emancipation, and resistance. So ideology It's a taken for granted assumption about reality. We don't think about it much. We just think about, in our work, this is the way things are. This is the way things function. It's a job. Hierarchy is taken for granted. We don't think about it too much. So that's ideology. And the power of ideology is often used in an organization to control the way that managers justify and legitimize their actions. All right, so Mundy and Gramsci developed this idea of hegemony. And this is when one group leads another group to accept subordination as the norm. Ideology, those taken for granted assumptions, are shaped in such a way that the control group accepts and participates in the control process put forth by the dominant group. Think about organizational rules, or there are movies that are built on this too, and I was trying to think of the name of the movie. I can't think of the name of the movie anyway, but the subordinate group accepts the control that is placed on them. Emancipation. So that's liberation of people from restrictive ideas, traditions, and power, etc. There's a long list that inhibit autonomy. Autonomy is the ability to make your own decisions and decide what you will do. Freedom from other influence. And then resistance happens when individuals counter power and control. Think about the Office Space clip that I put up. And if you've ever watched the movie Office Space, it's all about these components of critical theory. There's so many excellent examples in it of critical theory. The ideology, the hegemony, emancipation, and especially resistance. So if you've never watched it, you could watch it with critical theory in mind, because it's a perfect example. With the theory of concerted control, I found a really good YouTube clip that explains concerted control, and it's in Unit 2 under the supplemental materials. The clip is by a graduate student but it's an excellent presentation, so take the time and watch the concerted control theory clip. All right, let's move on to feminist approaches. Feminist approaches are often combined with critical approaches, and I like the way that Miller positions feminist approaches separately because it deserves to be set apart from critical theories. All women do not encounter the same issues at work, and Miller argues that we must divide into subgroups of women that include race, gender preference, etc. Miller also argues that women's issues are often thought to occur within a neutral organization. So it's like women have the issues, not the organization. Therefore, the blame is placed on women or individuals. So scholars who take a feminist approach to organization share these assumptions that organizational language is patriarchal. In other words, it's controlled by men and valued based on the male type of language. The most valued characteristics among employees and organizations are male: logic, aggressiveness, and competitiveness. This leaves out room for female characteristics or more feminist characteristics. So stereotypical feminist characteristics are usually downplayed in organizations, and these type of characteristics include emotion, empathy, intuition, connectedness, and cooperation. There are several types of feminist views or approaches, but that is beyond the scope of our discussion today. Just know that organizations are gendered and generally thought to be dominated by male ideas, and that women are often overlooked according to feminist theories. That's the whole idea with feminism, theories of feminist approaches to organizations. All right. The topic I want to touch on today is the concept of disciplined bodies, which includes, it's one of your discussion questions. Angela Trethewey and her colleagues have examined how the organizational context controls how women use their bodies in the following ways. So, how they display their bodies. So, for example, there's an ideal way that women should look. They should be slim. They shouldn't be overweight. They should maintain their bodies to look appealing and pleasing. There's also the way the organizational context controls how women move their bodies. How do women walk? They should walk in a neutral gait. They shouldn't swing their hips. They should look professional, quotation marks. How do they cross their legs? Do they cross their legs at the ankles or at the knees? How do they gesture? What's their nonverbal? So all of this, of course, is nonverbal, but how are they moving their bodies? How is that controlled by the organization? And then third, how do they maintain their body too? And this is part of display, but do they wear makeup to work? Does the makeup look, quote again, professional? Does their clothing look appropriate according to organizational norms? Because women can't wear any kind of revealing clothes if they're in an organizational context. Because again, we're thinking from this perspective, we have a neutral organization, and if something is wrong, then you blame the individual, or in this case, the woman. So women's bodies, according to Trethewey and her colleagues, are controlled in these three ways. Think about it. Think about if you work in an organization, what are the expectations of how you should look, what you should wear? Should you wear makeup? So these are all these ideological ideas, these taken for granted assumptions that we simply accept. All right, this concludes my notes on Chapter 6. Again, take a few minutes to watch the video about concerted control and let me know if you have any questions.